When I die, then make my grave high on an ancient mound in my beloved Ukraine, in steppeland without bound, whence one may see wide-skirted wheatland, Dnipro's steep-cliffed shore, whence one may hear the blustering river wildly roar. So reads a stirring excerpt by Taras Shevchenko, the father of modern Ukrainian literature. Shevchenko's forefathers had been free Cossacks, and yet his family were bonded serfs, subjects of the Russian Empire. Shevchenko never lived to see a free Ukraine, yet his paintings, poetry and prose evoke a powerful yearning for the self-determination of his people, a soul-stirring love for their language and culture, and a bitter resentment of Imperial Russia, whose rule they had to endure. In our previous video on the pre-modern history of Ukraine, we covered the dismantling of the autonomous Cossack Hetmanate and the annexation of Ukraine into the Russian Empire. In this video, we will explore the lives of the Ukrainian people during the centuries of Tsarist rule, and examine how they kept a uniquely Ukrainian language and identity alive against the Imperial Russian regime's heavy-handed policies of cultural Russification. This video was sponsored by our kind YouTube members and patrons. Becoming a YouTube member or patron is the best way to support our work, so we're now providing our supporters with exclusive videos to thank them. Join their ranks to watch the Pacific War series, alongside the First Punic War, Sulla's biography, the Italian War of Unification, Risorgimento, the Russo-Japanese War, Albigensian Crusade, History of Prussia, and much more. 80 or so exclusive videos in total. In 2024, YouTube members and patrons will watch series on the Fall of Sparta, the Reconquista, Second Punic War, Spanish War of Succession, and Russian Civil War, and will continue getting early access to all videos, access to an exclusive Discord server, will know our schedule, and vote on future videos. YouTube member and patron support allows us to keep the majority of our videos free in a world where YouTube monetization income is very uneven. If you want to support our work, join their ranks today via the link in the description and pinned comment. Thank you. After Hetman Ivan Mazepa's decision to back the wrong horse at the Battle of Poltava, the Cossack Hetmanate's fate was sealed. As the Great Northern War came to an end, and the borders of Europe were redrawn in Russia's favour, there was no room left on the map for the troublesome and frequently rebellious Free State, whose autonomous privileges had been progressively stripped away in the preceding decades anyways. Thus, after the final liquidation of the Hetmanate in 1767, and the rising of the Zaporizhian Sich in 1775, the self-determination of the Ukrainian people came to an end, and for the next century and a half, they were ruled directly by the Romanov Tsars of the Russian Empire, as part of the province of Novorossiya, or New Russia. Under Russian rule, Ukrainians were officially referred to as Little Russians, as opposed to their Muscovite rulers, who were called Great Russians. This juxtaposition highlighted how the Imperial Russian regime saw the Ukrainian people, not as a distinct and independent nation, but as a long estranged younger sibling, finally brought back into the fold. Throughout the remainder of the 18th century, Russia's borders continued to rapidly expand to the south and the west, at the expense of its two greatest rivals, Poland and the Ottomans. By 1783, the Ottoman-aligned Crimean Khanate, whose deadly repartee with the Free Cossacks of old looms so large in Ukrainian folklore, was annexed into the Russian Empire. Meanwhile, the halcyon days of Poland-Lithuania, which had once been the juggernaut of Middle Europe, were also well in the past. Succession in the Polish monarchy was determined not by primogeniture but by election, something that Russian agents were all too happy to exploit, much in the same way they had once exploited elections in the Ukrainian Hetmanate. Consequently, Poland essentially became a Russian protectorate, with its parliament, or Sejm, serving Russian interests. Eventually, Russia abandoned the pretense of soft power and, in collusion with Prussia and Austria, took a bonesaw to the entire country. The result was three infamous partitions, which saw the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth wiped off the face of the map. For centuries, the Ukrainian people had managed to protect their self-determination through a careful balancing act, playing the three major powers of Russia, Poland, and the Ottoman Empire against one another. Now, with Ottoman power in Eastern Europe crippled, and Poland just straight up gone as a polity, Russia had officially won the centuries-long three-way struggle for control over Ukraine. Indeed, by the beginning of the 19th century, the vast majority of what is now modern Ukraine had been wrangled into the Russian Empire, including not only the former lands of the Cossack Hetmanate and the Zaporizhian Sich, but also much of the formerly Polish-controlled territories of right bank Ukraine. It should also be noted that not all ethnic Ukrainians became Russian subjects after the falls of the Cossacks. Following the final partition of Poland, Galicia, the erstwhile heartland of the medieval Kingdom of Ruthenia, ended up in Austrian hands. However, our video will focus primarily on the Ukrainians under Russian rule. In the year 1830, the Polish people erupted into rebellion, a rebellion which the Russian Empire resolved to brutally crush. During this insurrection, members of the French Parliament, sympathetic to the Poles' plight, began calling for their country to provide armed intervention on their behalf. In response to these Parisian warhawks, Alexander Pushkin, considered by many to be the father of Russian literature, wrote a patriotic poem titled "To the Slanderers of Russia." In it, he denounced the French as outsiders interfering in a family affair. What right had they to criticize how Mother Russia punished her Slavic children for being disobedient? For, as Pushkin challenged, will not all the Slavic streams merge into the Russian Sea? Through this, Pushkin invoked an arrogantly imperialistic attitude common among the Russians of that age. According to this mindset, it was both logical and inevitable that all Slavic peoples would eventually accept Russia's assimilating embrace. Yet Pushkin's prophecy was a false one, not only for the Poles but also the Ukrainians, who throughout the era of Tsarist rule never gave up their aspirations to be a free and independent people once more. With that said, many Ukrainians, especially former Cossack nobility, willingly integrated themselves into the Russian body politic. As compensation for their lost rights as a ruling elite in the Hetmanate, the Cossack Starshina were equalized with the Russian nobility. Many entered imperial service, and some achieved the highest government ranks. Through education, intermarriage, and government service, a sizable contingent of the Ukrainian nobility gradually became Russified. Meanwhile, the Cossacks of the Zaporizhian host had always held themselves apart from their cousins in the Hetmanate, and this continued under Russian rule. Following the destruction of the Zaporizhian Sich in 1775, many Zaporizhian Cossacks were relocated to Azov and Kuban, where they merged with pre-existing bands of Cossacks in those regions. A far cry from their independent, freebooting roots, the descendants of the wild Zaporizhians were transformed into the Tsar's personal attack dogs, used as a mounted police force which kept order for the Tsar in his most far-flung provinces, or as paramilitary bands which helped expand the Russian frontier through the brutal subjugation of native peoples. Tragically, the Cossacks played a starring role in the horrific genocide of Circassian peoples in the northern Caucasus, and feature centrally in the stories told by many Jewish families today of the violent pogroms inflicted upon their forefathers. Nevertheless, even if some Ukrainians secured a privileged niche for themselves under Russian rule, most were not so lucky. The majority of Ukrainians were not Cossacks but peasants, and for them, life became decidedly worse under the Tsarist thumb. One of the greatest accomplishments of the Hetmanate had been the abolishment of serfdom and the establishment of the right of Ukrainian peasantry to move about freely, own property, and in some cases even govern themselves. However, in 1783, serfdom made an ignominious return to the Ukrainian steppe when Empress Catherine issued a decree shackling the local peasantry to the estates they worked. Under Cossack rule, the Ukrainian common folk had been free men and women, but under Russian rule they were reduced back into a state of practical slavery, becoming the property of the aristocracy on whose land they toiled. During the early 19th century, the Russian government founded universities in the Ukrainian cities of Kharkiv, Lviv, and Kiev. These institutions were centers of propaganda, whose prime directive was to attract the sons of local Ukrainian nobility and turn them into agents of Russian influence and promoters of Russian identity. In these imperial academies, Ukrainian elites were taught that their ancestors had been nothing more than a wayward branch of the Russian people, cleaved from the motherland by the Mongols, and deprived of their natural unity with Moscow for centuries by the insidious Poles. Consequently, it was their duty to amend this historical injustice and participate in the reintegration of the Little Russian people into the Great Russian body politic. However, this top-down assimilation campaign backfired spectacularly, for many among the Ukrainian intelligentsia, the descendants of free Cossack officers, summarily rejected the rewriting of their histories. Consequently, the very universities designed to Russify them instead became thriving centers of uniquely Ukrainian artistic expression and political activism. One intellectual firebrand from this era was Mykola Kostomarov, a young professor of history at the University of Kiev. The son of a Russian nobleman and a Ukrainian peasant woman, Kostomarov is considered to be the father of Ukrainian historiography. Defying the imperial narrative, he asserted that the Ukrainians were not just a temporarily estranged offshoot of the Russians, but had been a separate and distinct people for all of history, going back as far as the days of the Kievan Rus. In Kostomarov's eyes, the two offspring peoples of that erstwhile medieval federation were not just divided linguistically and culturally, but psychologically. Russians, historically dominated by the rule of Grand Dukes, Tsars, and Emperors, were inherently predisposed towards stern autocracy, while the Ukrainians, whose identity was steeped in the untamable Cossack, were naturally inclined towards values of personal liberty and individualism. Through his analysis of the Slavic past, Kostomarov made his political ideals clear, exalting the virtues of historical polities which had been governed by free assemblies, like the Zaporizhian Sich, and being harshly critical of historical nations with dictatorial systems of government, like the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Among Kostomarov's many distinguished peers at Kiev University was Panteleimon Alexandrovich Kulish, a Ukrainian novelist, historian, and political commentator whose many literary accomplishments include the first translation of the Bible into the modern Ukrainian language and the penning of many novels, which both romanticized and eulogized Ukraine's free Cossack past. However, both Kostomarov and Kulish's impact on the social memory of the modern Ukrainian people are dwarfed by their friend and comrade, the poet Taras Shevchenko, known to today's Ukrainians as Kobzar, the Bard. Born in 1814 to a family of serfs in right bank Ukraine, Shevchenko developed a natural affinity for painting as a youth, but his talent was unable to flower under the doldrums of the slave peasant life. He received his big break as a teen, when he entered into the service of a local magnate who moved to St. Petersburg, taking him along. In the beating heart of the empire, young Shevchenko quickly attracted the attention of Russia's most prestigious artistic community, who took it upon themselves to fundraise his freedom. For a sum of 2,500 rubles, they lifted Shevchenko out of indentured servitude. Despite spending most of his young adult life living in St. Petersburg, Shevchenko's paintings evoke a powerful sense of longing nostalgia for the land of his birth, as does his poetry. In defiance of imperial high society, in which highbrow literature was expected to be published in Russian, the language of the ruling elite, Shevchenko insisted on publishing his works in his native Ukrainian. "Do not pay attention to the Russians," he once wrote as the preface of an anthology of Ukrainian poems. "Let them write as they like, and let us write as we like. They are a people with a language, and so are we. Let the people judge which is better." Throughout the 1840s, Europe was becoming a political powder keg, with absolute monarchies throughout the continent struggling to suppress growing outcry for liberalism and democracy in the countries they ruled. The Russian Empire was no exception to this trend, and before long, the growing cast of Ukrainian free thinkers had joined their voices to the chorus. In December of 1845, Professor Kostomarov, Professor Kulish, and Mr. Shevchenko became the founding members of the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood. This clandestine society had lofty, ambitious, and far-reaching goals, which included the abolition of serfdom, broad access to public education, and the transformation of the Russian Empire into a federation of Slavic republics, with Ukraine as a free nation within that federation, and the Russians being one among equals rather than the dominant nation. The society's manifesto, written by Kostomarov, asserted that the Ukrainian nation would rise from the grave, re-embrace its democratic and egalitarian Cossack roots, and save all the enslaved nations under the Russian yoke. Throughout history, secret societies have often been the catalyst of successful revolutions. However, in the case of the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood and its beautiful dream of liberalism, democracy and equality for all Slavic peoples, it was not meant to be. In the spring of 1847, just 1 year after the society's founding, its existence was discovered by Russian authorities, and its leading members were arrested on the direct orders of Tsar Nicholas I himself and sentenced to internal exile. Kostomarov was deported to Saratov, where he was forbidden to teach or write for the next 6 years, with his fellow Kyiv University faculty member Kulish subjected to a similar fate. Of the 3 ringleaders, Shevchenko was treated the most harshly. According to legend, Tsar Nicholas I, who spoke fluent Ukrainian, personally read Shevchenko's Dream, a poem which included some rather colourful imagery about him. Nicholas laughed good-naturedly at these parts of the poem, evidently not bothered at being described as a wicked, vicious, bloated, green-faced, poison-fanged tyrant. However, when he read the verse that mocked his wife, the Empress Alexandra, for being wrinkled like a dried-up prune, he became enraged. "I suppose he had his reasons not to like me," the Emperor of all the Russians bellowed, "but what has she done to deserve this?" For taking part in a seditious conspiracy against the Russian Empire, and for being a big meanie who hurt the Tsar's feelings, Shevchenko was sentenced to 10 years as a lowly private in the Russian army, where he was forbidden to paint and write. Ultimately, the fact that Shevchenko, Kostomarov and Kulish avoided lengthy prison sentences or execution made their punishments exceptionally lenient for the standards of the time, but this was not because the Russian government was inherently benevolent or merciful. Instead, imperial agents feared that if they made martyrs out of them, they would only further inflame Ukrainian separatist sentiments, or worse, drive the Ukrainians into an alliance with the Poles, with whom they could launch a joint rebellion against Russian rule. The fact the situation was so politically precarious for the Russians was perhaps a testimony that their attempts to assimilate the Ukrainian people were not going as smoothly as planned. And indeed it wasn't, because in the years after the liquidation of the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, a network of hromadas, secret self-governing societies run by the Ukrainian intelligentsia, emerged in every major city in Ukraine. These hromadas picked up where the Cyril and Methodius Society left off, working in the shadows to strive for the rights of the Ukrainian people within the Russian Empire. The hromadas served their local communities in various ways, establishing local schools and libraries where Ukrainian literature could be studied, hosting public events where traditional Ukrainian customs were practiced, and publishing newspapers, journals, and literary works in Ukrainian, which were disseminated across the Ukrainian provinces of the empire. All of this undermined the efforts of the Russian government to Russify the Ukrainian people, so naturally the imperial regime came down hard. In 1863, Pyotr Valuev, the Russian Minister of Internal Affairs, issued a prohibition on the use of the Ukrainian language in official publications. A separate Little Russian language never existed, does not exist, and shall not exist, Valuev remarked scathingly, going so far as to denounce the Ukrainian language as nothing more than the Russian language corrupted by the influence of Poland. In 1876, this ban was reinforced by a secret decree of Tsar Alexander II, which erased the Ukrainian language from all public spaces entirely, prohibiting its use in everything from public lectures, plays, song performances, and every level of public education. The damage that these repressive policies did to Ukrainian culture was immense, but ultimately the Russian Empire's attempt to destroy the Ukrainian identity was a failure. One need only recognize the modern Ukrainian language's healthy native speaker base at 27 million strong to see that. Indeed, throughout those dark years in the late 19th century, the Ukrainians clung on to their heritage, despite the draconian policies implemented by their Muscovite overlords, designed to make them feel ashamed of it. Although the amount of Ukrainian literature being published during those years no doubt took a plunge, the bans never succeeded in stopping them entirely, and although they were forced to sink deeper into the shadows, the hromadas continued their work, using ingenuity, subterfuge, and bribery to keep the Ukrainian language and culture alive. In the 20th century, the absolutist rule of the House of Romanov had begun to weaken. In 1905, the Ukrainian people were at the forefront of a wave of revolutions which rocked the entire empire. These revolutions failed to overthrow the Tsar, but did result in some liberalizing reforms, including the implementation of the limited parliament, the State Duma, in which the Ukrainians were represented with their own caucus. Moreover, the bans on the Ukrainian language were repealed, allowing Ukrainian journals, newspapers and books to once again be published openly. In 1917, as the Russian Empire came crashing down amidst the smoky chaos of the Great War, the Ukrainians seized the opportunity to secure their freedom and revive their statehood. Yet, no sooner had they liberated themselves from the Muscovite yoke, did they find themselves back within its grasp, not in the form of a monarchist empire this time, but a union of socialist republics. As Ukraine entered into its Red Century, challenges and opportunities lay ahead, as well as both grand triumphs and catastrophic tragedies. In our next episode on the history of Ukraine, we will explore the history of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. To ensure you don't miss that, make sure you are subscribed and press the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.